Well, here we are. We've done a possibly inadequate job of trying to talk about the meaning and the content of Christian love, and we're going to have to continue talking about that since that's the main theme of the course. But today we want to look into an aspect of ethics which is not often dealt with by modern or Protestant ethics, and that's the area of virtue. When people think of ethics, or when people think of moral character, they quite often think of virtues, and sometimes virtue is kind of the main theme or the main content of ethical discussion. That certainly was probably true in terms of Aristotle and folks like him. Virtue, the word virtue just means a power. Now, the question in looking at Christian ethics versus the ethics, other humanistic ethics or other philosophical ethics, the question is, where is this power from? What is the power that creates virtue? We all have some idea about what virtue is. It's different ways of describing character. And by character, in the sense of ethics, we mean good things about people. And we've already emphasized in both the Old and the New Testament that the source of ethics, the source of love, which is the central theme of ethics both in Judaism and Christianity, the source of ethics is the character of God. Well, how do we bridge from the character of God to the character of human beings? One way in which people have done it over the centuries is through the concept of natural law, which we've already indicated. From the very beginning, philosophers who became Christians tried to attach Christianity to the philosophical ethics of the good philosophers, of the people that they considered to be good philosophers. For instance, Augustine considered Platonism or Plato to be almost Christian. And so he would pick up then on Plato's conception of virtue and conception of ethics and play off it in terms of trying to see how biblical ethics would apply to it. So a great deal of Augustine's analysis of virtue actually owes a great deal to Platonism. And a great deal of Thomas Aquinas' analysis of virtue owes a great deal to Aristotelianism. Now, one of the points, Ramsey is not one of these guys who just declares all thinking outside of the Bible to be of no value. He accepts that thinking outside of the Bible is of value. But he also points out that where Christian ethics in Augustine and Aquinas has been helpful, most helpful in understanding the ethics of the Bible, these ethics, whether they're Platonistic, Neoplatonistic, or Aristotelian, have been transformed considerably by their definitions and their content have been transformed considerably by the fact that Augustine and Aquinas were Christians. There still was a great deal of remainder in Augustine of Platonism and in Aquinas of Aristotelianism that a great many Christian theologians, particularly since the Reformation, have considered to be unfortunate leftovers. One of these has to do with the nature of virtue as commonly understood by philosophical theologians. Virtue, as commonly understood by philosophical theologians, is a natural, inherent human possibility. That doesn't mean that everybody has virtue, but if they're going to get virtue, they're going to have to produce it themselves, so to speak. Because if you have the Aristotelian Platonic view of God, you do not have God as a person reaching out to you, judging your activity on the basis of what he actually created you to be. And so there's no revelation that says, thou shalt be courageous, or thou shalt be humble. There's not even a revelation, thou shalt be moderate. But moderation turns out to be a very important virtue for philosophical theologians, for philosophical ethicists. Because moderation sounds like the wisest way to bring about a synthesis of ethics and of ethical possibilities. There's nothing that sounds wiser than being a moderate. If you don't believe it, just listen to politicians who are trying to run for president. Some of them are as liberal as you can be, and some of them are as rightist as you can be, but they don't want to. If somebody asks them, "Well, aren't you an extreme rightist?" Very few politicians who want to get elected are going to admit being extreme rightists. Very few politicians that are going to be elected are going to be admitting to be extreme leftists. So wherever you are, you try to focus on the fact that in these issues you're moderate, because moderate sounds good. We had Barry Goldwater in the 60s, who made a speech in the Republican convention in which he says, moderation is no virtue, and in the pursuit of truth, extremism is no vice. Well, the interesting thing is that in perspective of Christian ethics, Goldwater was right. In perspective of political ethics, he missed the mark very far, so he didn't get, there really wasn't much possibility of him being elected, because you do not get up and announce you are an extremist and get elected, because an election is based on politics. That is, it's a science of people. And in the science of people of goodwill and of intelligence and wisdom always tend to think that the moderate perspective, or that moderation is the best ethical position to be in. As Ramsey points out, however, you can't read either the Old Testament, but you certainly can't read the New Testament in terms of Jesus' ethic and Paul's ethic, or Jesus' life, or Paul's theology of Jesus, and come to an ethic which is a moderate ethic. The ethics of the Bible are extreme ethics. They are radical ethics. A moderate ethic, for instance, would look at people. If you're going out, for instance, to do good to somebody, a moderate ethic would be very wise and intelligent in the way it determines who you should help. Well, we've already seen that that is completely undercut by the radical gospel and by the radical concept of Christian ethics. It doesn't make any difference what you see, what your wisdom or your intellect or your analysis sees in the other person. That's not the basis upon which you do good to them. That's not the basis upon which you love them. Well, that is an extreme that's an extreme ethic, and radical Christian ethics have always been criticized on that basis, and that is a good criticism. In other words, if you want an ethic of moderation, there are some aspects of Christian ethics that promote moderation, but the most basic part of Christian ethics, which is disinterested love, is not a moderate ethic. It is a hard ethic. It's an ethic that is not going to be very immediately attractive to somebody. In order for you to convince me that I'm supposed to love someone and to do good to someone, even if he is a louse or, or a scumbag. You're going to have to give me some other source of the virtue to do that, because I don't have it generally inside myself. And even Aristotle, who assumes that you can grow your own virtue through habit. That is, what you need to do is just start doing what is good, and pretty soon, through habitus, through habitual activity, you will grow a character which includes certain virtues. And one of the certain virtues is moderation. Well, once you've grown the Aristotelian concept of moderation, you have, in a sense, grown a virtue which is not compatible with Christian ethics, in some senses. In the ordinary sense that we ought to be moderate, that's true. We ought not to eat 5 gallons of ice cream. That's immoderate. And in that sense, if you're applying your ethics to the eating of ice cream or the eating of anything else, or if you're applying your ethics to physical culture, that is, that you need to get enough exercise. You need to get a moderate amount of exercise. You don't need to get an extreme amount of exercise, because that actually tears you down instead of builds you up. But you need to get a moderate. So there are a lot of things, just ordinary things, in which moderation is good. But in the most basic elements with which Christian ethics deals, moderation is not good. And that doesn't sound very attractive to people, because they like to consider themselves wise. Well, as Ramsey is going to point out, in terms of Christian character, the most important thing is not being wise. The most important thing is not wisdom judging character or virtue. The most important thing is not intelligence judging character or virtue. The most important thing is the virtue itself and how it is derived. Because intelligence is a kind of virtue, but it is not really a moral virtue. Intelligence is a kind of power. Socrates believed that he had wisdom because he had a daimon, a demon. Well, that's what demon means, is a power. So you can use the word Greek, the Greek word daimon, as to mean power, and it can be used in a rather neutral way. So you can think of wisdom as good, and yet being produced by a demon power. And yet this is not a moral accomplishment. Making the most out of your intelligence might be considered a virtue, a moral virtue. But from the Christian perspective especially, and Paul makes this clear in several contexts, knowledge puffs up. In 1 Corinthians, he's talking to a group of people and he's telling them, well, I hear from the letters that you've written me that the people who are writing the letters, at least, consider themselves to be very knowledgeable. And they found some members of their congregation who are not very knowledgeable. And so they're picking on them. They're mistreating them because they're not very knowledgeable. I don't know whether I don't know how long you've lived, but you've probably lived long enough to see people being picked on for not being intelligent. Made fun of sometimes for not being intelligent. As though intelligence was a moral virtue. A moral virtue is, wherever it comes from, a moral virtue from my perspective is to be able to avoid picking on somebody for not being intelligent. In fact, or for not being orthodox, or for not being run-of-the-mill or average. That's one of the things that people are just beginning to pick up on, I've noticed. The Columbine shooting and then the shooting just recently in California. We've focused on the guns, and of course we need to focus on guns. We focused on the bad families that maybe these people had, or at least the fact that their families were not conscious enough of what the kids were doing. And all of those are true, you know. You ought to make sure that kids can't get guns. You ought to make sure that that families are focusing on the needs of their kids. And it's obvious that in the cases of these kids, they had needs which the families were not focusing on. But some of them had needs which the families were focusing on, but they couldn't get any help from the community. And one of the places where they couldn't get any help was, guess what? In school. Because these people, because of whatever it was that disturbed them from their upbringing and their family life, they brought it to school. And so they were weird. And one of the great moral virtues in American schools is to make fun of weird people. You know, it's to pick on weird people. Those of us personally who have experienced being picked on in school understand that a little bit. Fortunately, we had, I assume that all of us in here had the strength to not allow that to cause us to go get a gun and shoot somebody. But it still is a mark upon our soul. It's a mark upon our psyche. I usually, when I'm teaching smaller kids, so I'll go ahead and tell you too. When I'm teaching smaller kids, I tell them that when I was in school, people would get in a circle around me and call me Lynn, skinny as a pin. Well, you probably can't believe that anybody ever called me skinny. But they did, because I was about a foot shorter than anybody else, and I weighed almost nothing. When I first got my driver's license, I still have my driver's license, which I got when I was 14. And it says, Lynn Mitchell Jr., weight 85 pounds. I played 110-pound football till I was in high school, which you know is usually limited to grade school and junior high. But I was Lynn, skinny as a pin. Well, I was a pretty tough kid, but that still made a difference in the way that I thought of myself. I was also from a migrant worker family, and so the day I went to school, I didn't know it, but everybody else knew that I was white trash. You know? And so, and every once in a while, somebody would actually call me white trash. In fact, one of my 5th grade teachers called me white trash. Their teachers like that, you know. And so if your teacher is doing that, and the students are doing it to you all the time, something might snap. Fortunately, I never snapped. I just kind of withdrew and waited till I went to college, because I wasn't going to learn anything from grade school or junior high or high school. I didn't learn anything from those. All my education I got outside of those. I read several encyclopedias word for word straight through, but this was at home. And so I didn't get an education at school, because I was one of those that did not fit in at school for various reasons. And the sinful thing is, which is also very important to understand, is that sometimes I did that to other people. Now, since I was skinny, you might think that I might not make fun of other people that are skinny, but you don't understand human sin. If a group of people were standing around making fun of somebody else that was skinny, I could usually think of him as being skinnier than me, so I could talk about him being skinny too. Or I could talk about somebody being overweight, or I could talk about somebody being ugly, or I can talk about somebody, drooling or something. There was always something you could find in your fellow students that you could feel morally superior about. Or at least you could feel superior about. So that kind of judgmentalism and that kind of extreme example of the lack of agape love, the lack of extreme love, is something that we need if we're going to stop or even slow down the kind of things that are going on in Columbine and other places. Somehow our kids need to understand that just being, upstanding citizens in high school and even being a Christian doesn't necessarily mean you're going to influence your high school to be free of this kind of thing, particularly if even a Christian participates in the segregation or in the isolation of somebody because he's not a Christian or because he's not one of your favorite people. So after each one of these stories, you hear these stories about how many of these young people in these schools are Christians, and it's good to hear those stories. But on the other hand, what we also need to hear is that there is no justification whatsoever for what those kids did by shooting other kids. But there's also a participation in sin even by the kids who were left, in that they were not sensitive enough or aware enough, or the teachers were not sensitive enough or aware enough to intervene to help somebody's need. And in order to intervene to help somebody's need, most of us need to like them. Well, that's the whole point, is if you liked them, they wouldn't have any need, because they would be in with the good group, They would be preppies or they would be football stars or cheerleaders or whatever it takes to be in good. So, that's the reason why just kind of an average, moderate, even a Christian moderation in your relationships to people is not necessarily optimum. Sometimes, if there were a few extremists among Christians in high school who actually got up in the morning and made it their business when they went to school to go and to be a friend to one of these people and try to understand them and try to give them a feeling of worth and so forth, that still might not necessarily keep it from happening, but it certainly would be a long step toward doing that. So when we analyze these kind of things and try to find out what the root are, it's not easy to do, because we want to focus on the horrible thing that these people have done. So it's not easy for us to focus on, well, maybe we're involved in the sin in this situation also, and we ought to do something about it. When we're looking at Christian virtue, we're again looking at a power. That's what virtue is. But if you're looking at Christian virtue, you're looking at a power that has a different content and has a different source from virtue as it's generally understood in philosophical ethics. So we need to look at the measure and unity of virtue, the source of virtue. And in order to look at the source of virtue, we need to look at the evocation or elicitation of virtue. That's what makes virtue, the concept of virtue, different in Christianity. In most philosophical ethics, what you do is you grow virtue, or you develop virtue, or you increase virtue by habit. But in Christian ethics, these are two good words. You don't develop virtue out of something inside yourself. Virtue is elicited from you. Though Christian ethics, through Christian ethics generally, there runs a deep undercurrent of opposition to every peril of Phariseeism. Christians, if you ask them, hate Phariseeism, by which they mean something that they probably should not use the word Pharisee to describe, because that's kind of an anti-Jewish expression that probably shouldn't be used. Because what we're meaning by Phariseeism is not that all Pharisees, that is, all of the Jewish group of Pharisees that were in the New Testament times, were horrible people who were arrogant and self-righteous. Because there were lots of Pharisees who were arrogant and self-righteous. But we can't possibly assume that there are more Pharisees who are arrogant and self-righteous than there are Baptists or Orthodox or anybody else. Religion tends towards self-righteousness if it is not extremely well understood and extremely well analyzed. Analyzed prophetically, analyzed ethically. So one thing that Christian churches need to do, especially in our time, is to quit using the word Pharisee as if it were a bad word. We should use instead, because of all the people in the world, there were no people of higher moral character in the world than the Pharisees in Israel at the time of Jesus. He wasn't in conflict with them because of their moral uprightness or their lack of moral uprightness. He was in conflict with them sometimes because they were so morally upright that they knew it and were proud of it. Now that is self-righteousness. And there is no doubt that many Pharisees were self-righteous. There's no doubt that many Christians are self-righteous. And I can recognize self-righteousness among atheists, among humanists, among everybody. Self-righteousness is one of the basic sins of human beings. It has nothing to do with which religion you are, or even if you are religious. You can be incredibly self-righteous and be an atheist. And you can be incredibly self-righteous and be a Christian. One thing that might help the self-righteous Christian is that if he reads his Bible enough and if he learns enough about his faith, then he will recognize, hey, there's something wrong with being self-righteous. Whereas if your ethics are not based on the character of God, there may not be any signs given to you that self-righteousness is somehow immoral. Because immoral self-righteousness can be the character of, in fact, most people consider self-righteousness to be a virtue. And one of the reasons for that is that humanistic and humanitarian virtues are sometimes based on something else besides the character of God and Christian love. So there's no transcendent key to judgment. I've used several illustrations before, but for instance, throw out again the Inquisition. The Inquisition was a horrible period of history, and it was an incredible breakdown of the Christian gospel. A lot of people look at it and say, well, that's just what the Christian gospel produces. Well, you need to understand that if Jesus had been alive during the Inquisition, guess who would have been one of the other people that was tortured? It would have been Jesus. And so there is a transcendent criterion by which Christians should judge themselves. And over the centuries, quite often, sometimes Christians have lived all of their lives without resorting to that criterion. And so they lived self-righteous lives, they lived and they died self-righteous. So there's no doubt about the self-righteousness that's possible among Christians, the arrogance that's possible among Christians, the ability of self-deception, the ability to justify things that are simply not justifiable on the basis of the Christian gospel or the Christian faith. In fact, Christian theology accounts for that. If you don't have an ethic that actually accounts for the fact that your members of your religious group are sinners, then you do not have a Christian ethic, because Christian ethics accounts for that. It begins with the assumption that anyone who is a saint is also a sinner at the same time. And so you can't as an individual, if you're an individual Christian, or you cannot count on that simple historical fact to mean that you're going to be an example to the world. You're going to be any light to the world, because you may reflect your surrounding culture. For instance, you could be a very conservative, very loving, very, at least you consider yourself loving, very loving Christian person in a small congregation in Alabama or in East Texas or in Mississippi in the 40s and 50s. And really thought of yourself as loving and moral and high-minded, and still have participated in incredibly ugly relations with black people. Even you could have even been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, because most members of the Ku Klux Klan also considered themselves to be self-righteous religious people. When I was a minister out in East Texas, 2 of the elders of my church had been former Ku Klux Klan people. And they didn't consider themselves, they had since repented of that, but even when they were Ku Klux Klan members, they didn't consider themselves to be evil. They considered themselves to be standing up for, quote, Christian values. Well, that's why it's important to understand that just using certain words like Christian values and Christian love does not mean that these words have the content that they should have. And that's what Christian ethics is, and a continual resurvey of our ethics and our ethical lives to see if they actually fit with the gospel, or if they actually fit with the definition of love in 1 Corinthians 13. And there's no place, if you know anything about religion, there's no place where things can get uglier than in a church, between members of a church. And so I always advise people who plan to go into the ministry, or even plan to be secretaries at a church, you better have a profound doctrine of sin. Because if you don't, you're going to get torn all to pieces. Because people who consider themselves to be the best folks on earth also are sinners. You have to tell that also to people who are not going into the church, but people who are going into service jobs like social workers. Social workers, and psychologists generally are people who have a tendency to want to be people helpers. So they're generally fairly idealistic. Well, what you need to understand if you're going to be a people worker, if you're going to work with people, is that idealism is the most dangerous thing to have. Idealism. If you have an extreme idealism, then that will actually interfere with your ability to help people. You'll discover, for instance, that, if you're working in child protective services, you'll discover that there's nobody you're going to work with that is going to make you feel good. You understand what I'm saying? There's nobody that you're going to work with that's not going to frustrate the heck out of you. That's the reason why they need you. It's because they can't live lives that are calm and moderate and so forth. And so quite often, people who want to go into a ministry, a religious ministry, or into a social service will have one or other of two experiences. Either they will just flat run up against a brick wall and quit and want to go into something else that's not so draining, or they would become cynical. And I've seen that over and over again. I've had lots of dealings with child protective services and so forth, and you'll talk to somebody and you'll realize this person has been here just a few years, but he or she is so cynical that they probably should not be in this position because they don't have the sensitivity to help people. And in fact, I saw I saw an event filmed on TV this morning before I started to class. A church, I forget where the church was. Christian Children Protective Services had raided the church and took into custody a large number of children. And it was a heart-rending scene because these children did not conceive of themselves as being abused. And so they screamed and hollered, that they didn't want to go with these people. But they still grabbed them all up and put them in the bus and took them off away from their parents. Better not advertise on TV. What had happened is this is a very conservative church. It was an African American church, and very conservative, and the pastor kept emphasizing, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. Well, that's not a direct quote from the Bible, but that's kind of an idea that you can find in the book of Proverbs and so forth. And so there are a lot of Christians, very conservative Christians, who still believe that corporal punishment is part of an arsenal that a Christian should have in punishing children. Now, in fact, I personally kind of thought that when I first got married. I've since changed my mind completely because I've seen that not giving children corporal punishment, but still giving them good discipline, actually turns out more content and well-adjusted children than beating them. And I was beaten. I wasn't beaten by my. If my mother had lived in the year 2001, she would have been arrested for child abuse, and I would have been taken away from her. Because man, she could beat. She would go out and get a tree limb, and she didn't say, well, I'm going to give you 5 licks, or even I'm going to give you 15 licks. She gave as many licks as she was mad enough to give. And she was a wonderful woman, except that she had been raised with this idea that this was the only way to make me into anything good. Well, I've never been a criminal, at least I've never got caught being a criminal. But, and so it may have done me some good. It may have done me some good. I suspect that I would have got along just as well without it. But anyway, the point I'm making is that why do these people in this government agency feel like they have the right to go in and raid this church before they find out whether there's really any child abuse going on? Because there's no there's no because of some complaint, because I could get you, if you have children, I could get your children taken away from you tonight. At least I could get somebody out there investigating you tonight. Because if I suspect child abuse, I am required by law to report it. And so there are a lot of people in these helping services who assume that it has already been decided by our culture that spanking a child is child abuse. Well, that has been decided by a large portion of our culture, but that still hadn't been decided by some members of our culture. And people need to think seriously and sensitively about what is going to hurt the child more. Maybe you can go in and try to reason with people and try to talk to people. But what's going to hurt a child more than just jerking him out of his family and putting him somewhere else without any real proof or without any real evidence that somebody is being abused, or using your own definition of abuse. That's a dangerous power that a lot of bureaucrats in America have. And I've seen it. It's important to have, because there are some children that need to be rescued. And sometimes these organizations don't rescue the children that need to be rescued and go out and grab children that don't need to be rescued. And so that means that there needs to be some real supervision and better training in this regard. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about any particular person who works at these organizations. I'm just saying that whenever you have a group of people, whether it's a church or whether it's the Child Protective Society Association or whether it's any other group of people, all of these people are sinners, and all of these people will have the tendency towards self-righteousness. So, Christian ethics, not necessarily Christians, but Christian ethics is usually highly critical of all self-conscious goodness. Christian ethics seems often not to care for goodness itself. In fact, that's the critique that the Catholic Counter-Reformation had of Martin Luther. That Martin Luther really didn't have much use for goodness itself, because Luther emphasized the radical nature of justification by grace through faith and not by works. Well, that sounds like Luther is not interested in whether you do good works or not, and that's not what Luther was saying. But sometimes that's the way it's interpreted, not only by people who don't like Luther, but sometimes by people who are followers of Luther. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Lutheran that you may have heard about, wrote a book years ago. Of course, he died during World War II. He was hanged by the Nazis. But he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. And in that book and in several other of his writings, he talked about costly grace. Because it's quite possible for Christians who have not done much in-depth study of their ethics or of their theology, just think of, well, salvation's free, meaning what? Doesn't make any difference what I do. And that's not what salvation is free means. Our salvation is, our justification is by the grace or the mercy of God alone. Well, that's true, as we're going to try to indicate here. Virtue comes from the grace and mercy of God alone. So it's not that we shouldn't have virtue or that we shouldn't do good works. We just have to understand what the source is. Nevertheless, the enterprise of analyzing virtues of moral character constitutes a large part of general ethical theory. In other words, I'm not going to write a book on ethics without discussing virtue, Ramsey is saying. But because virtue is as a language of ethics. But when you're studying ethics, when you're studying Christian ethics as opposed to Aristotelian ethics, you have to use the words that they use, but you have to understand what the content of those words are. So virtue in Aristotle and virtue in Christianity cannot mean exactly the same thing. So you got to find out why. There's a need, therefore, for an account of Christian faith and love primarily by these alone. Faith and love. Virtue by faith and love. Too often, analysis of moral goodness springs from some form of coalition ethics in which Christian themes prove the sleeping partner. As in Augustine, Neoplatonism is the coalition ethic. And sometimes Christian ethics, Christian themes are kind of a sleeping partner. That is, Augustine sometimes talks as much as though the revelation of ethics came from Plato than from his Christian faith. Same thing is true with Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. And in more recent times, self-realization ethics. Self-realization ethics is the popular ethic of modern Christians. And it's also the popular ethic of modern non-Christians. The other day on television, Pinnacle, this show on channel on CNN that does a biography on wealthy people, extremely wealthy and extremely successful people, did a biography on Deepak Chopra. And they quoted somebody as saying, Deepak Chopra is the most important spiritual leader of the century. Well, that's certainly what Deepak believes, and I'm not in any place to make any ultimate judgment about the theology of Deepak, but the theology of Deepak is in many ways diametrically opposed to the theology of Christianity, and therefore his ethic is in many ways diametrically opposed. And so, but it is a self-realization ethic. In fact, it's a God-realization ethic. It's the assumption that myself is God. And therefore, he says he is not religious. And when people call him religious, he gets very angry. In fact, he gets angry quite a bit. But anger is not always bad. But the point I'm making about Deepak is that he represents a non-Christian version of self-realization, of extreme self-realization, in that it is a view that says that I am God and that there's nothing else but God. And so the realization of myself is knowing God. In fact, his latest book that's making millions of dollars is called How to Know God. And as they were interviewing him, he was walking on the beach with his shoes off. And the interviewer was walking along. I don't remember whether she had her shoes off or not. But the interviewer was walking along and said, "Now, what do you enjoy about walking along the beach since you do not believe that this is real?" Well, then he went into a discussion of nature and his communing with nature. And he communes with nature even though nature is not real. The ultimate reality is simply God. But then she asked him, "Do you read?" Well, I don't know whether he was telling the truth or not, but he said, "No, I don't read books." He said, "I just read nature." In other words, he has no place at all in his worldview for any outside wisdom. Wisdom outside himself. Revelation from outside himself. It's all in there. And all we have to do is just dive in and find it and come up with it. Well, that is a respectable view. It's obviously so respectable that a tremendous number of intellectuals, particularly movie stars and other celebrities, are making him a billionaire. So it's obviously something that's attractive and generally respectable. Yes, he's married. Yeah, in fact, his wife and his daughters also have businesses that are making millions of dollars. Of course, that money's not real, but it still does pretty well. But anyway, my purpose is not to make fun of Deepak, but just to say that if you're doing ethics, you have to understand that there are differences in what people believe. And the differences have a great deal to do with the way they're going to relate to other people. Deepak, for instance, was on Bill Maher's show. Any of you watch Bill Maher? Deepak was on Bill Maher's show, and he's on there quite often. And Bill Maher has him on as his spiritual guest. And Bill Maher got Deepak on the show one night, and he says, well, now you're a religious... What Bill Maher was talking about was Woody Allen. Now, Woody Allen used to be one of my favorite people in the world because he is incredibly gifted, genius at a kind of a profound insight into human foibles. And so he used to be studied in seminaries, his movies, because they ask very deep existential questions. He happens to be an atheistic Jew, but he still thinks very deeply about death and so forth and so on. And so he was a favorite among religious people. They just had theological people. They just had a little problem with him recently because he's married his daughter. And that's what Bill Maher was picking up on, because Bill Maher is a lapsed Catholic. He was raised a Catholic, but he doesn't believe much in religion anymore. And he takes every opportunity to make fun of it, especially conservative religion. He has lots of liberals on, but more conservative religion he makes fun of. Anyway, even Bill Maher was angry with Woody Allen for being so immoral as to marry his own daughter. And Deepak says, well, don't judge him. You don't know where he is. And Bill Maher says, yes, I do. He's in bed with his daughter. But anyway, Deepak kept defending Woody. And there may be a defense for Woody. There certainly is if Deepak Chopra's view of the world is correct. But Bill Maher says, well, I thought you were a religious man. And he just exploded. No, I am not a religious man. I'm a spiritual man. So that's one of the buzzwords different in America today. There's an ethic of spirituality that's opposed to Christian ethics or ethics of revelation. And that ethic of spirituality is almost always self-realization. And so even when it's made inroads into the church, which it has, there are Christians, Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, Catholics who watch Deepak and other people like Deepak all the time and never notice the incongruity between their understanding of reality or their understanding of ethics. Bill Martin, who's the professor of sociology of religion over at Rice, gives lectures on this kind of thing, and he calls it Christianity Light. That is, it's a very comforting kind of religion. You don't have to judge anybody. You don't have to judge anything. You just have to go with the flow and just get into your interior and find God. And God can't be wrong. Well, you can't argue with that. So if I'm God, I can't be wrong if I understand myself properly. So, self-realization ethics is a very important modern alternative to Christian and Jewish ethics. Now, how do you measure moral character? He says, how to measure moral character has been declared to be the most important question in the world. infinitely superior to the concern for knowledge, we've already talked about this, and twice infinitely superior to the concern for happiness. Well, now, of course, there are ethics, generally labeled historically as hedonism, for which the primary concern is happiness. But we've already talked about that to some extent. But still, people, especially if you're thinking in terms of Christian and Jewish ethics, moral character is a more important question than knowledge or happiness. I was a great fan of John Kennedy. In fact, I was probably one of 5 people on my campus that voted for John Kennedy in 1960. And so, I was an idealistic young guy, and John Kennedy sounded like, man, he was going to be the new Messiah. And so people loved him. If you didn't live, during that period, you can't realize how it was almost a religious devotion that people, or religious mysticism that people had about Kennedy. So when Kennedy was shot, well, 2 things happened at the same time. One of my brothers was killed, and then Kennedy was shot. And so I just went to bed. And I didn't get out of bed for weeks. I was just, my whole idealism had been exploded, and if your idealism is exploded and you're thrown into a depression, you don't want to do anything. You say, well, I must have been a wimp. Well, that may be true, but the fact of the matter is that was an extremely traumatic period of my life. But while I was in bed, my roommate brought a Saturday Evening Post. And I looked at that Saturday Evening Post, and on the cover it said, "You have no right to happiness." And I said, what in the world is that? I had been a fairly religious person, but I was kind of turned off by religion. And it was by a man named C.S. Lewis, and I had never heard of C.S. Lewis. So I turned over and read this article, "You Have No Right to Happiness." How in the world could anybody be so un-American as to say you have no right to happiness? Because that was our basic ethic, is that, the pursuit of happiness. You have the right to happiness. And we use that to justify almost anything. We use that to justify divorcing a wife that we have made a covenant with, just because she kind of gets stale. We just decide, well, I have a right to be happy. Everybody has a right to be happy, so I'll just throw her out. And Lewis was saying that this is an ethic which lots of people who call themselves Christians buy into these days, but it is exactly the opposite of Christian ethics. In Christian ethics, obviously, even a Christian wants to be happy, but you don't have a right to be happy if by being happy you actually abuse someone else. That was his main point. So that was very helpful to a guy who was in a depression because he thought his happiness had been totally destroyed. And so I began to read C.S. Lewis, and I eventually wrote my master's on C.S. Lewis. And wrote a book on C.S. Lewis, submitted it to a publisher who in 1968, said that C.S. Lewis had reached its peak and nobody would be reading C.S. Lewis anymore. That's 1968. And of course, almost all of the C.S. Lewis stuff has come out since then, and it's still come out. The C.S. Lewis estate is still making, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and C.S. Lewis has already gone wherever he's going. Anyway, moral character can still be considered to be more important than the question of intelligence and knowledge, or the question of the concern for happiness. In other words, as C.S. Lewis would say, it is more important for you to keep your vow of faithfulness to a woman or to a man than it is for you to be happy. And he personally did that when he was in World War I. He went into the war with a friend, and they were in the trenches in France. And his friend was killed. But before his friend died, his friend asked him to promise to take care of his mother. Well, that's one of the amazing stories that you need to read about sometime, is C.S. Lewis taking care of that woman then the rest of his life. Because C.S. Lewis, that was in World War I, C.S. Lewis died November 22nd, 1963, same day that Kennedy died. So for all of those years, he took care of that woman. And what you need to know is that that woman was horrible. She was just a horrible person. She just made his life miserable. And you would think, that a guy could just say, well, if that's the way she feels about it, I'm going to go do something else. But he didn't. He decided that he had made this promise, this vow, and so he stuck to it to the end. He even married a woman who was kind of horrible because he was trying to help her. Now, that he may be just masochistic, but on the other hand, he may really have considered that to be an indispensable part of Christian character, to do that. That's the extreme of Christian ethics. It's not attractive. It's not attractive to take care of that woman 40 years. And I know some people who are doing that to this day, who take care of older people whose minds have already started going, and you can't ever do anything that suits them. And that's just a hard job. But there are people who do that every week, day after day after day. People that are not even kin to them. So that's why happiness per se cannot be the goal of Christian ethics. That doesn't even make these women happy. They're still messed up. They're still hostile and so forth. So that's not the goal of Christian ethics. The goal of Christian ethics is to do good to the person, whether it makes you happy or makes you feel good or not. Christian ethics answers not by encouraging a moderate or well-rounded development of all human capacities, but by pointing man to a standard of excellence altogether outside himself. Now, I haven't been required yet, probably because I haven't put myself in that position. Because it's a courageous thing to put yourself in the position where you vow to take care of somebody the rest of their lives when they are so difficult to take care of. But I have been in a position where I've taken care of people for a little while that would drive you crazy. And it takes a standard of excellence greater than anything I have to make me want to do that. Because life can be much simpler. For instance, if I hadn't had teenagers, I would still be sane. Life would have been much simpler. Or if I just got rid of them when I found out that they were going to complicate my life. But there's a standard of excellence that's beyond my capability that enables me to do some things like that. Not as much as a lot of people that I know, but that's what you mean by when you're looking in Christian ethics for a standard of excellence outside yourself and a source of power outside yourself. In its ideal for character, the Christian religion does not begin with man's natural capacities, suggesting merely how these may be best balanced and developed. It begins wholly outside of ordinary human nature itself and from beyond our general experience of moments of self-realization, and suggests that these be made to conform to the Christ standard. There's an expression I used to hear a lot, and I still run into it some. I don't abide fools very well. And that's by a person who really considers himself to be morally superior. And being morally superior, he can't abide people who are not morally superior like himself. Well, that's just a different morality from Christianity. Christianity, the Christian ethic says, I will abide fools. That is, I will love fools. I will take care of them. I will do whatever it needs. Because if I don't do it, who's going to do it? If even the best ideal or the highest ideal of some ethics is in opposition to doing that, then who else is going to do it except someone who has this extreme conception of agape or love? Insofar as we are in process of growing into maturity of Christian living, it is because we too look away from ourselves towards such love as was seen in flesh only in Jesus Christ. Now, it's not hard to get people, even people who are not Christians, to admit that Jesus was a remarkable human being. And it's also not hard to judge Christians in the light of Jesus and to say, like Mahatma Gandhi said, he said that he was once tempted to become a Christian. And he would have become Christian if he could have found any Christians that were like Jesus. So even someone who's not a Christian can recognize the remarkable nature of Jesus. But for Christians, that should be the key criterion of what your life should be, is looking at Jesus. And so just being a Christian and just going to church may not even, and often does not even, provide you with an opportunity to even contemplate what it means to be like Christ or to be conformed to Christ. In other words, religion is just a religion. And a religion is, a Christianity which is just a religion is untrue to Christianity. So we need to, according to Ramsey, allow this, that is the love of Jesus Christ, enfleshed in Jesus Christ, to be transcribed into our lives. And what Paul, for the first time in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, transcribed into language. In other words, if you read 1 Corinthians 13, love is this, love is that, love is the other. Paul is not just kind of thinking up good things to say. What he's trying to describe is what he sees in Jesus Christ. And so what Ramsey is saying is what Paul has transcribed into language in 1 Corinthians 13 and is there for everybody to see. The goal of Christian ethics is to transcribe that into our lives. Now that is an impossible ideal. If you read 1 Corinthians 13, you realize that you never live up completely to that. And if you think you do, then what are you? You are self-righteous, which is the sin of failure to love. And so that's the irony, that you can consider yourself self-right, or you can consider yourself righteous in love, when considering yourself righteous in love is actually the denial of love. So there's always this impossible possibility, but it's always there. And it's not a rule book. 1 Corinthians 13 is not a rule book. Well, today I'm going to go out and grit my teeth and learn that love never fails. And then after I learn that, then I can go out and grit my teeth and say, and love endures all things. No, that's not the point of Paul's writing. Paul is simply transcribing what love means. He's not telling us that we can actually kind of magically become that. We just see that in Christ, and then from Paul's perspective, we have to let the power of Christ, virtue of Christ, come into our lives. But it's not an infused virtue, such as in Aristotle and Aquinas. An infused virtue, you got to imagine a human being sitting here, and he doesn't have enough virtue. So an infused virtue is you just kind of screw the lid off the top of his head and pour virtue into him until it fills him up. That's kind of the Aristotelian picture of how, or the Thomas Aquinas picture of how virtue, Christian virtue, comes into people. What Ramsey is saying, and of course you just have to decide which one of these pictures you think is more accurate. What Ramsey is saying is that grace does not infuse something inside you. It elicits action from you by setting you free to be what God wants you to be. You're set free to be what God wants you to be. And so it's not like getting your gas tank filled up. It's like getting into a relationship. If you're in a relationship with God, then you know the character of God, then you know that your response to God's grace is manifested in two different ways. One is by faith in God and thanksgiving to God and praise to God. And the other is by loving your neighbor. But loving your neighbor is not a virtue that you develop. It is a command that you obey. And it has to be obeyed every time. In other words, you're not a virtuous lover all of your life. The command to love your neighbor has to be obeyed every time. Now, you have to, in a sense, start from scratch every time, except that you know what needs to be done because you know what Christ has done and what Christ requires. And there is a kind of a development into maturity, so that there is a kind of a way in which Aristotle and Aquinas are right, and that is that you can get more into the habit of loving, but you still have to always understand that even if you get into the habit of loving, that the source of that is the love of God, not your love. Not love that you have kind of stored inside you. Because it is love that is elicited. Just like when a child is born, that child cannot be human, cannot know how to love unless he is loved from the outside. And if you have a child that is never loved from the outside, he will never learn to love. In other words, his love has to be elicited. And it's the same with love in general. Our love has to be elicited because we're not going to naturally be inclined to it. as you can see by remembering all the illustrations I've given of love in the extreme. Love that is not comfortable, in fact, love that is miserable, that doesn't produce happiness in me and doesn't produce happiness in the person that I love in the superficial sense of happiness. It might produce blessedness in a more profound sense, but it doesn't necessarily produce happiness, and that's what we want to avoid altogether these days, is to be unhappy. Okay, we will talk some more about this next time.